We go. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you all for joining today. Great to have you with us for this continuing series about the history of the Workman and Temple families in the greater Los Angeles area. We are moving into the 1860s, so we started off by talking about the arrival of the families in Mexican California. We went into the 1840s, Mexican-American War, the beginning of the gold rush. Then we went to the 1850s and the peak of the gold rush for the first part of the decade, and a lot of the things going on during that period that were challenging, but also opportunities that the family pursued. And now we're moving into the Civil War era, and locally a flood and drought period followed by really the first significant period of growth in the Los Angeles area. So a lot of interesting things to talk about today. And then next time around, we'll go into the 1870s when there was really a lot of change happening in our area during what would be called the first boom in the region. So at the end of the 1850s, there were some tough times. The gold rush had basically ended by the mid part of the decade. The cattle economy that drove what happened here financially in this region was severely affected. There just wasn't the demand. There had also been other animals brought in from Texas and places like that to compete. There was a national depression in 1857. How much that affected Los Angeles is a little hard to know from direct evidence, but it probably had some effect. And it was just going to get worse as time went on. So by the time that this drawing was done and it's sanitized, meaning it makes things look a little neater and cleaner than you would otherwise see, but still fascinating for some of the details, the backyards and the Orno or outdoor oven down here at the bottom, that sort of thing. But you're looking at a community that was about around 4,000 people within the city of Los Angeles in 1860. The county was several thousand more than that. And there would be this flood and drought period during the first half of the 1860s, where I think there was actually probably something of an exodus. People probably left because opportunities weren't good. So by the time you get to 1870, the population of Los Angeles is pushing 6,000 officially. That there's probably something of a decline in the middle of that. In other words, you go from maybe 4,500 to somewhat below that, and then you get that increase. It's still a small town. Population is not that big yet, but there are some changes underway. But first, there has to be this period of severe stress going on in the area. It began with what we now know as El Nino. They had no idea, of course, what these weather cycles were like on a scientific scale like we do now. But the El Nino means significant amount of rain. Christmas Eve, 1861 is when it started, and it has been said it rained 39 of the next 40 days. So that means biblically, it was referred to as Noah's flood. Estimates generally around 50 inches of rain that fell that winter. We have had about 4 inches the last 2 years each. So just to give you some contrast with that, now, of course, we have water delivery and from far-flung places and that sort of thing. What we also have is flood control, which, whatever the merits of that are now in certain cases, that's pretty important to have when you've got something like this. 50 inches of rain when there is no effective way to divert or deal with that water meant a real catastrophe. So you can see in this newspaper article snippet that there were rumors, because it was probably hard to communicate for a while after this happened, that the entire settlement of Anaheim, which had just been started a few years before by German and German Americans looking to settle and establish vineyards along the Santa Ana River, had been completely destroyed by the flood, and expressed the hope that that was not the case. Out in San Bernardino, there was a concern that almost everything in that valley had been destroyed. And again, there was hope that that was an exaggeration. And one of the drastic evidences were the dead bodies of 13 native indigenous people that had been discovered in that area, drowned by the flood. The population, again, wasn't high here, so the loss of human life was relatively small compared to what we're used to with other types of floods throughout the country or the world at that time. But again, the news was hard to come by because it was difficult to find out what really happened with a lot of these places. With the Workman and Temple families, the one piece of evidence that we know is that at the Rancho La Merced in the Whittier Narrows, the family of FPF Temple had their home flooded. They had to escape by a raft. And I don't know how they did that, just fashioned something together very quickly, climbed on it, and got through. Now, they were situated literally in the Narrows, south of what is now Leg Lake and Whittier Narrows Park up there. So the San Gabriel River, at that time, the Rio Hondo came through. And the good part about that is you had ready access to water. The bad part is during these floods, it could just be devastating. So I'm really amazed that the family was able to live as long as they did in that location. Fortunately, no injuries were sustained by house, property, or people in that case. So the devastation was pretty significant. I've seen figures of a couple 100,000 cattle died during that flood period. And again, you're talking really about a month of very, very heavy rain. And then comes La Nina, and you're talking about the drought conditions that will follow. And so 1863 and 64, as this account says, were extremely dry years. Estimates pretty much like we've had the last 2 years, a few inches of rain each year. But again, they weren't able to extract water from the Owens Valley or the Sacramento Delta or the Colorado River like we do now. They had to rely entirely on local sources. This is an account that was written up by John Harrison Temple, who was one of the many grandchildren of William and Nicolasa Workman, the owners of the homestead, part of Rancho La Puente. John was a little boy. He was born 1856, so he was one of those who had to climb on the raft to escape the family's home in that deluge at Whittier Narrows. But he spent a lot of time over at his grandparents' house, several miles to the east. And so what he talks about is that, well, he says it was not much more than an inch of rain in those 2 years. That's not what I've seen with other sources, but in any case, it was still pretty devastating. And he is pretty much correct that for the most part, cattle raising was either ended or had been significantly depleted as a result of the flood drought combination. He says that Workman, his grandfather, had to kill 2,000 head to save their hides, meaning to keep the skins so that they could be sold for whatever they could find in the market out there. Cattle driven out and were shot. He says that he saw animals going to cactus patches and they could barely walk and try and get anything to eat, and they would get their heads and mouths full of cactus needles and that sort of thing. Curiously, he says one of his greatest ambitions was to follow his grandfather through that corral and see him shoot these animals. And he said his father was considered one of the best shots in the West. Now, how many people would have claimed that title back then? And he said he proved it many a day, though he was 63 years of age. And that's an interesting thing to think about, too, is the age of people and dealing with these kinds of disasters. How do you bounce back as a cattle rancher from these kinds of things when you're, in those days, 63 years was really advanced. Sort of the 70, meaning 70 years was a pretty healthy lifespan back then. What John Harrison then says, and he's writing this many years later, but after that drought was over, Workman turned to raising crops more than the cattle. Now, Workman was a bit unusual in that he still had thousands of animals. He had a large enough property, about 25,000 acres, which was half of the rancho, so that he could maintain both. And so into the 1870s, he still had large herds of cattle, but he was pushing more of his emphasis into farming. So what John says is that there were 5,000 acres for wheat raising called the Wheat Field Ranch. Now, this is just a detail of a map of the ranch. I'll show you a larger version of this later on, but this is north of the homestead, what would be West Covina, Baldwin Park area. Down here in the bottom, there's a hill area where it says House of William Workman's Wheat Rancho. This is somebody else's comments put on it, but the same commentary is on the original map down here. As far as I can tell, these are the ends of the San Jose Hills where Azusa Avenue cuts through West Covina between the 60 and the 10 freeways. And so that vast plain between those hills and the San Gabriel River would be the Wheatfield Ranch. 5,000 acres is an enormous amount of property for one person to have just by itself. But of course, Workman had 20,000 more than that. So he was using roughly about 20% or 25% of his ranch for wheat in the late 1860s. Interestingly, John talks about the difficulty of geese, ducks, and cranes getting into the fields. And of course, when you have the flyway of birds, making their way up and down the Pacific coast, this is probably part of that issue, is they're making way one way or the other, going north to south. And he said they would be in the field by the thousands, which is why a lot of people back then loved to go bird hunting in various parts of Southern California. And men were continuously employed to guard the wheat. He also notes that a mill was started at that time, and I'll refer to that as well. So this is an indication of how the Workman family and others are starting to really move into agriculture in a big way because of the devastation of the floods and droughts. And I won't go into a lot of detail about some of this information here, but it is interesting to see Some of the outsider accounts, there was one in 1860, a visitor named John Quincy Adams Warren traveled down from the Bay Area. 5 years later, there was a committee of the State Agricultural Society that visited. And so this is the 1865 account. So right after their drought was over. And so when they visited the Temple Ranch at La Merced and the Whittier Narrows, they found a certain amount of grazing hill land on the ranch. The ranch was about 2,300 acres. So only about 10% of that was considered to be usable for farming. And Temple had about maybe 35% of that cultivated. So only 80 acres. So you can see a big difference between what the Temples had on their ranch and what William Workman had on this much more massive property. But there was an interesting discussion about the kinds of things that were being grown. Sugarcane, for example, was being tried out there, a full acre of that. And they thought they would award a premium to him because it was the best that they found. There was a little bit of tobacco being grown. Now, part of this too has to do with the period of time in the Civil War, and I'll refer to that a little more later on. Corn. He has an orchard with all kinds of trees. So it's interesting to see these accounts: peach, olive, fig, pear, apple, apricot, and so forth. Quite a bit of melons and pumpkins, and still 1,000 head of cattle. So again, it isn't like just you had this magic evaporation of the cattle and farming just pops up. There's going to be that transitional period going on. Then the group, escorted by Temple, heads over to the eastern part of the San Gabriel Valley. They visited John Rowland's place, for example, which is just a little bit east of the Workmans. And then when they got to the homestead, they found a vineyard of 10,000 vines, which is a pretty substantial size of a property for that. And that would be an area just south of the Workman house. And I'll talk again about some irrigation relative to that. And what they said was, fine bunches of the sweetest grapes we have tasted in this or indeed in any other country. And by country, they don't mean other nations, they mean parts of California. The closest they could find was at San Fernando. So what they did say was they could have been better pruned and free from weeds. These are continual issues that vineyardists had to contend with. But it's interesting that they found a high quality grape out here at La Puente. Again, like Temple and other farmers, Workman diversified. So he's got some corn growing, 10 acres of that. There's quite a few fruit trees, not unlike what was at Temple's, but pomegranates in this case. And they do mention the house as a well-built adobe, cemented. And by that, what they meant was the outside of the building had been painted to look like granite. Quite enclosed in a courtyard, so there were wings on it. We talked about this in the last presentation, but the house at that time was basically a U-shape with the forks of the U heading towards the south. And they accounted the size about 90 by 200 feet, which is a little bit bigger than we've seen other accounts mentioned. But interestingly, they say that this and Mr. Temple's are the best built adobes we have seen in the state. And maybe that's why the Temple family were able to get out of their house with on a raft and not lose the building, because it was so well built. They concluded by saying that Workman had everything that could be desired in a large plantation, which is an interesting wording for California. The house, workshops, and a flower garden protected by a good brick wall. And so it's, again, we don't get a lot of these accounts, so it's nice to see these when you get a chance to find those. So farming becomes the big thing. And it wasn't just that the grapes were so well grown and probably better than any in the area, according to at least that group of people, but there was quite a bit going on with the other types of farming they were doing. These are newspaper articles from 1868, 1869. And so there's a talk here about Workman and Rowland having a new wheat district, and that there's great success that they're hoping for this. This is happening, by the way, out in the San Fernando Valley. Lancashire and Van Nuys established a huge wheat raising operation out there. So it's comparable to what you're seeing out here in the eastern San Gabriel Valley. Another one talks about a much larger amount of grain grown or sown, pardon me, in 1869 than you'd seen before. About 1,500 acres in total for a lot of these. You've got Workman, John Rowland, and Rowland's son-in-law, John Reed, being the principal ones here. And occasionally there would be news of prolific produce from these places. So this is an 1869 article that says a bunch of barley, 125 stalks, all from one seed, came from Workman's property. So farmers are perfectly happy to send that information into the paper. And of course, this one says, let that circulate and see who can beat it. But the point is that there's showing here a lot of the fertility of the soil. We tend to forget, as we have been further and further removed from our agricultural era. We have paved over, and built upon our environment, that this area was really a agricultural paradise. You had the climate and the fertility of the soil just unmatched anywhere else, probably in the United States. It was the Civil War era too for a lot of this early part of the 1860s. So there were attempts to grow cotton out here. That idea obviously was because of the southern states having seceded and then the war going on, and a demand, especially in Europe. England, for example, imported a lot of cotton for its massive textile mills and factories. So the idea was maybe Los Angeles could be an area to raise cotton. And for a couple of years was a big effort, not just the Workmans and Temples, although they were among the most important, but a guy named Watson, who had married into the Dominguez family at the South Bay out towards Gardena and Compton, those areas. John Holt, who had, I believe, been out in the El Monte area initially. So there were attempts to do this. It didn't get anywhere because the war ended and it was just too far away to have a good market, and the cotton quality may not have been what was hoped for. But again, there was some push on this. You can see a couple more articles here, including tobacco. So again, these are things that were big in the South because of the concern about whether there would be a market available outside of the South if the war continued on for too long a period. 5 years is a long time as it was, or about 4 years. But in any case, interesting to see some of the experimentation going on. So lots of other things that, again, you could bring out here. This is an 1868 article, and it does talk about Workman's Mill being built. So he was not only doing the wheat and corn and other field crops, but building his own mill. John Rowland had had one since the late 1840s, close to his home. And Workman's son-in-law, FPF Temple, had purchased someone else's mill near his house. So there were other examples like this. Henry Dalton up in Azusa, for example, had one also not too far away. And it got to the point where Workman had so much of this going on that by the end of the decade, he was starting to sell barley seed and wheat seed to people. So there was a lot of that going on as well. One other thing I just wanted to mention, where Temple got into the act too, as far as promoting his own prodigies, so squashes and other vegetable products he was sending into Los Angeles to show how prolific his produce was as well. So again, some other examples here of selling seed that Workman did, and hoping to make some money from that. And again, this is a guy pushing 70 years old, expanding his operations. Now, a big part of this is going to be irrigation too, not so much for the wheat, because you can dry farm that, meaning rely on whatever is happening with rainfall. So in the San Fernando Valley, which really didn't have access to too much water, the LA River basically starts in that area, but there wasn't much of a flow going through there, unlike the San Gabriel Valley, where you did have more natural water coming down from the San Gabriel Mountains. But it's more for things like the orchards, your nuts, the fruits, as well as the vineyards. And so we know from a study that was done in the early 1880s, I believe, maybe mid 1880s, that both families, like others, had dug ditches. These are very simple earthen ditches, just dug out of the ground, nothing fancy, but enough to be able to bring water where you needed it. So on the bottom here, for example, the Workman Ditch, this came right off of San Jose Creek, which begins out in the Pomona area and then emptied into the San Gabriel River. That had water year round, pretty much, the creek did. So they were able to draw water off of that. And it talks about the fact that this is the old farm ditch of the Workman Appointed Ranch, and it went right to the homestead. The vineyard of 25 acres. This is later than Workman's lifetime, so it was probably smaller amounts than he had been doing, but about a mile in length. So this was going right into our property where the museum is today. Down by his mill, another ditch. Off the San Gabriel River itself, there was a Workman ditch, and one that Temple had done. And so these are really great pieces of information to get an idea of how they were able to utilize water to be able to irrigate those crops that were becoming more and more important after the Civil War. Now that mill, this is a detail of a 1870 map. The San Gabriel River had changed course just a couple of years before, during another big rainstorm period, a wet winter. And then former Governor Pico had done his own irrigation ditch off the old course, which is the Rio Hondo. And that ditch that he did, the irrigation ditch, brought so much water from the rainfall coming and the rainwater coming out of the San Gabriel Mountains that it actually took his ditch and created a new river. So we now have the Rio Hondo to the west, which is the old course, and you have the San Gabriel River we know today on the east as the new river, as it was known. after 1867 or 68. And it was about that time that Workman built his mill. The dates are not known for sure, but sometime around 1865 to 68, somewhere in that range, he built that. So today the 60 freeway comes off here and goes west to east, just above where the mill is located. Workman Mill Road comes in from Whittier, the Paso de Bartolo Rancho, crosses into the corner of La Puente Rancho. Workman Mill Road comes right into this area and goes basically northeast, if you know the area at all. But 605 would be just a little bit to the west, going sort of like this as well. So if you know the area, that's where the mill was located. And then at the same time, again, mid-1860s, Workman builds 3 large brick winery buildings. He had been growing grapes since the 1840s, but he had been either selling the grapes as just clumps of grapes to people who would do the pressing somewhere else. But by the mid-60s, he's deciding he's going to make his own wine on the property. And so he's going, or expand that at least. So this is the largest of the winery buildings. There's one you can barely see off here to the left. A third one was off camera across from this larger building. Those stood until the early 1970s, and they had been converted into different uses over the years, which we'll talk about in subsequent presentations here. But he was really making a move to professionalize his operations, expand what he was doing. And again, as he's get into what a lot of us would consider to be retirement age today. Of course, back then, people didn't really retire. They just did what they did until they couldn't do it anymore. As I said, stock raising continued to happen, raising cattle, horses, that sort of thing. At the very end of the 1850s, there was an article, the only one I've seen relative to the families, about a recogida, which is basically you're going to get all the animals together from people who have different ranches because there wasn't any fencing, and you've got to separate these animals. You separate them, and knowing you can do that because of the branding, of course, but that was what was done. You had a judge of the plains, which is an official position. In this case, a gentleman, Felipe Lugo, whose family owned the Rancho San Antonio, southeast of Los Angeles. There is a Rancho Procrero de Felipe Lugo that the Workmans and Temples owned in what is now South El Monte. And so the judge of the plains was basically appointed every year to oversee these processes of getting animals together, making sure they're branded according to law, that sort of thing, separating the herds when they've gotten mixed together. That was the job of that person. And so this recogida took place just west of the Workman home. And it talks about the most exciting scene, all these horses and animals that were being driven into corrals and examined by the judge of the plains and those who were assisting him. And then after that was all done, Workman had a dinner, presumably for them, or probably lunch and dinner over the course of a couple of days. So you don't see a lot of these descriptions of these events that were being held on ranchos. So it's always great to see those when they come along. And even though there is this flood and drought period, there was still talk about the importance of raising stock in the area. FPF Temple and Fielding Gibson, who was an El Monte resident, they were looking to actually expand what they were doing. Now, this is May 1862, so they had just had the floods that had receded. The drought hadn't started yet. So there were still ideas of being able to expand that industry out here. One of the things that Temple and another partner, a guy named Jackson, did is they began to import pedigree horses. And this is becoming a bigger and bigger thing in Southern California. And it'll become even bigger in the late 19th century. But the idea of bringing in pedigree horses for horse racing, for example. And so Black Warrior was brought in by these two gentlemen, and they were going to begin to have him stand for mares, basically meaning he's going to be a breeder of continued horses. And of course, when you want the pedigree, it's very important to list that. This is an advertisement in one of the newspapers in February 1863, just as the drought is going to start to become a bigger and bigger thing. But Temple in particular got into other pedigreed animals, cashmere goats, for example, hogs, that sort of thing. As I said, this is a gentleman, William Workman, who's getting along in years, but he is definitely ready to move into the next phase of his life and expand what he's doing. But one of the problems he has is the ongoing issue with what's called the land claims process. This started because after the Mexican-American War, the decision was made to have landowners who had been given grants under Spain and Mexico prove their claim through documentation. The original documents they received from their grant from local authorities, also witness testimony. That process started with an act of Congress in March 1851. The fall after that, meaning fall 1852, there was a board of land commissioners, 3 gentlemen who came down to Los Angeles and had hearings so that the locals could file their claims. And the process moved pretty quickly initially. So by April 1854, there had been a confirmation of the claim by the commission. The policy of the United States, however, was to appeal every successful claim, no matter who it was or what reason. They just wanted to push it up to the court level and hopefully find a way to get that land converted to public uses, finding some technicality perhaps in the grant that would render it to be invalid. In the case of La Puente, the first court hearing was in 1856, December term, which really meant early 1857, and the court confirmed the grant again. And so it seemed like that would be it, and Workman and Temple could finally get their patent from the government. But the government kept pushing back. They challenged the survey that was done shortly after that. They had to have a professional survey done to submit to the federal government, and then they could get their patent. That was supposed to be the process. Henry Hancock, a name you might have heard of, Hancock Park in Los Angeles, for example, was the surveyor. And what the government claimed was that there were still problems with the survey. There were disputes about the boundaries with other ranchos. So it was just really an attempt to try to delay the process and force it into the courts for a longer period of time. It finally transpired that in 1860, Congress passed an act to revamp the mapping process because it was just taking too long. And so that forced the government to have to do something. And so they filed a petition with the district court in Los Angeles, federal court, to have another hearing. And that took place in 1862. And once again, Workman and Rowland were the victors in that. And despite that, the government continued to try to argue that there were various reasons why the rancho should not be confirmed, that Governor Pico, who gave the grant in 1845, the second grant to the rancho, didn't have the authority, that the size was in dispute because it had been expanded by Pico, all kinds of things. And by the time the Civil War broke out, the government was a little bit distracted. So these petitions, it wasn't just Workman and Rowland, there were many other ranchers who were kind of in limbo during this period. The government just wasn't really acting. And so what John Rowland finally did, and this is just after the Civil War was over, this is June 2, 1865, is he writes a letter to Henry W. Halleck, who had been one of the really important figures in early 1850s land claims issues, because he'd been sent out to analyze the land grants and to determine how valid they were. And he felt actually that they were quite valid. And then he went off to, in the Civil War, to be chief of staff for Abraham Lincoln as part of the United States Army, and then wound up after the war in Virginia. And Rowland wrote him asking for help. And this is Halleck's reply. It's a little bit hard to read, but he says, "Your letter of March 9th got to me. It's not in my power to help you. In fact," he says, "I'm having my own trouble trying to get a patent for my lands." But his advice was, "There seems but one way to expedite business in that office," meaning the general land office. "Hire an agent and give him plenty of money." And what that meant was basically go get a lawyer and have him do what he can do for you. And Rowland, in fact, did that. He hired a man named Henry Beard. Beard was a gentleman who wound up having this argument that he presented to the federal government, and it wound up being printed. And he's writing this to the Secretary of Interior. This is July 1866. So we're talking close to 15 years after the original filing by the landowners was made in Los Angeles. And Beard goes into a long discussion with precedent and all that sort of thing. And it seemed to be what was necessary. So Halleck had the right idea. Just get somebody to be your agent in DC to make this happen for you.
Paul, we've
Yes.
got a question that came in. Were there squatters on the disputed land in the 50s?
There absolutely were. And one of the big problems that a lot of ranchers had throughout California were people who were coming out during the gold rush thinking they were going to make their pile of money, and that wasn't going to happen. But in some cases, it could be just people who are migrating out here too. But they're looking at these big ranches on the coast mostly and seeing one or two people owning thousands of acres. And that was just, they couldn't understand why that should be allowed. And so in our local case, it was people coming from the southern states to establish communities like Lexington and Gallatin. These are southern names along the San Gabriel River. One of those became El Monte. And so there were people who were settling, squatting on land owned by the Workmans and Temples, not La Puente so much, but more ranches that they had on the west side of the San Gabriel River, what would be now South El Monte. And there was a lawsuit instituted in the late 1850s. It lasted a few years. There were 26 squatters who were sued by Workman and Temple and their compadre, Juan Matias Sanchez, who was co-owner of Rancho La Merced, and they got their court decision. The problem with that then becomes you get a court ruling, now you get to enforce it. And how is that going to happen? And at some point in the 1860s, Workman had basically publicly said, it was in the paper, that he was willing to sell ranch land to bona fide settlers. So I think he realized that it was going to probably have to be a process where he would have to negotiate with some of these people to be able to work out an arrangement. But yes, squatting was a big problem in lots of places. This is the land patent that was finally issued by President Andrew Johnson in 1867. So the 15 years that it took for these guys was actually a little under average. The average claim took 17 years to prosecute. By contrast, Workman's son-in-law, FPF Temple, and his Rancho La Merced co-owner, Juan Matias Sanchez, they got their patent in 1872. Took them 20 years. Now, just think about what happened between the early 1850s and say the end of the 1860s or into the 1870s. You had the gold rush coming and going. You had economic depressions. You had flood and drought. People died in the course of 15 or 20 years. Many families would take their ranches, and if the original grantee died, it would be split among the heirs. And dividing property could be a real problem for a lot of reasons, including agreement on how to proceed with your claim. There's just a lot of issues. And there were lawyers who also took their fees for representation with grant to property. There were unscrupulous lawyers too, who did not inform their clients of what was involved in the process, how much it was going to cost them, not just for the lawyers, but the surveyors. Californios, or Spanish-speaking residents of the area, also were not as familiar with the legal system of the United States as they would have been, of course, with Mexico. And so it was a problem for them as well to be able to withstand all of this. And you got the squatters and all of that. So just a lot of pressure on property owners. There was one man, an American actually, named Carpenter, who owned Rancho Santa Gertrudis, the La Mirada area, who committed suicide because he had gotten into financial trouble and his land claim hadn't been settled. And so it could lead to those kinds of issues as well. But finally, with that patent, what William Workman and John Rowland could do is divide their property up. And I'm sure they would have done this much sooner if they could have gotten their patent earlier. But they had a map drawn up in 1867 and 68. It didn't draw a line down the middle because that wouldn't make sense. You have to take the hill land and the valley land and work that out. So all of these columns around the map are very precise designation of survey stations. But at the very bottom is a table that says, okay, Workman's hill land is X and Y. Rowland's hill land is Y and Z, and the amount of acreage has to be basically equal because it's 48,790, which means 24,395 each, and we want it to be as precise as possible. And so that's why Rowland got areas to the north and east and south primarily, and Workman mostly to the west and central to make sure it was as even as possible. So for example, John Rowland had what is now Cal Poly Pomona. Part of that is in his rancho, a Covina area into a bit of Baldwin Park, Rowland Heights, Diamond Bar, some parts of Walnut, whereas Workman had the central part, Walnut, West Covina, a little bit of Covina maybe, Baldwin Park, that sort of thing. So it was divided in a way that was as equal as possible. Interestingly, just when you look at these maps, it's kind of cool to see the different things that are on here. Now, writing like this that I'm pointing to, it says Mill of John Rowland, that was on the original map. So the surveyor would have write that in. He put Workman's dwelling and Workman's chapel, the church inside the cemetery that we still have the cemetery today, but not the chapel. People went on and later and wrote in other stuff on this version of the map that we have, but you even get indications on the map of roads going through the area. So these two that I highlighted, one says Workman's Road to Anaheim Landing. That was a port developed by citizens of Anaheim where the San Gabriel River emptied into the Pacific, where Seal Beach and Long Beach now meet. And so he was an investor in that process. It was an attempt to try to get a port outside of San Pedro Momentum going. Rowland's Pass to Anaheim is also here. And I'm pretty sure that that is Hacienda Road going into Orange County, La Habra, in that area, because it's just due south of where we are at the homestead, which is in the screen box. So kind of fun things to see on some of the maps. Also, Workman's Mill is indicated on that map right next to San Jose Creek. Here is the San Gabriel River running through that area. Again, the Homestead Museum is over here to the right. The rodeo grounds. So this is written in later, but that would be where that recogida I referred to earlier happened. And then the sheep rancho of Temple is on the original map. Someone added FPS name to it. This is Avocado Heights, that area to the west of the homestead. So again, some really neat details you get out of these maps. Now, there were other land holdings that were acquired by the families over these periods in the 1860s. A lot of this is because of the financial distress people were feeling. In this case, William Workman had bought a loan money to Henry Hancock, the surveyor, who had worked on the rancho back in the 1850s. And so Hancock couldn't pay Workman back, and Workman foreclosed on Hancock and anybody else who had an interest in the property involved here, which is called the Rancho Rodeo de las Aguas. Rodeo de las Aguas is basically Beverly Hills. So for a few years, William Workman owned what would later become one of the most expensive pieces of real estate in the United States. Too bad he couldn't hold on to it or have his family hold on to it for just a few years in the 1860s. As part of that deal, he also obtained some vineyards by the Los Angeles River. And there was another guy named Jonathan Scott, who had been a judge in Los Angeles, who had borrowed money from Workman and couldn't pay the money back. And so Workman foreclosed on him and was able to pick up some property in what is now Glendale, southern Glendale. So he was making financial deals and benefiting through foreclosures, which we'll keep in mind for the 1870s talk that we do, because the tables are going to turn. Now, briefly, I'll mention Jonathan Temple, the first member of the Temple family to live in Los Angeles. He came here in the 1820s, the late part of that decade. And by the 1860s, he had gotten involved in Mexico, financial operations there. He had a mint, lease of the National Mint that he had arranged. He was spending a lot of time visiting his daughter, who had been living in different places like New York, and Paris, and France. So he was quite a bit of an international traveler. He decided in the early 1860s, with the floods and the droughts and all that, that he was going to actually extricate himself from Los Angeles. He sold his Rancho Los Cerritos, which is most of the Long Beach area, 27,000 acres down there. He sold it in 1866, just after the drought, for 50 cents an acre. Land values had plummeted from what they had been before the floods and droughts. So the Bixby family that came in and bought that got a tremendous deal. And Jonathan wound up moving to San Francisco. I think he felt like that was a better place to be, that maybe Los Angeles just wasn't working out anymore. And he was probably not the only person who felt that way. So he wound up leaving the area. This is a photo of the gardens at the Rancho Los Cerritos. Jonathan planted most of this. This is probably 4 or 5 years afterwards, some of the Bixby family in there. And so he had invested a lot in Los Angeles over the course of his almost 40 years here, but he decided to decamp to the city by the bay. That's where he died in 1866. But as Jonathan leaves, his much younger half-brother is staying here and expanding his involvement in the area. If Jonathan had lived a few years beyond 1866, he would have seen a dramatic change as Los Angeles rebounded and got delivered from all that pestilence that had taken place. It wasn't just floods and droughts. There were locusts invading the area. There was smallpox. There were all kinds of things happening, almost a biblical kinds of devastation in that first half of the decade, but a dramatic change by the end of the 1860s. So FPF and his wife, Antonia Margarita Workman, are going to expand their family. They had several more children. They wound up having 11 into the 1870s, 8 of which lived to be adults. The family did stay at La Merced Rancho. This is the adobe home that I mentioned at the beginning. It got flooded and they had to get out of it on a raft. But by the time this photo was taken, circa 1870, it was a prosperous property. They had a nice water tower, expensive fencing. They were growing all these crops, like we mentioned before, the cotton and tobacco and sugarcane and what have you. And as well as FPF Temple did as a farmer, he was really continuing to look into business as the key to the future. One of the early things that he did in the mid-1860s, again, this is much like his brother selling his nearby Los Cerritos Rancho at a pittance. FPF and Fielding Gibson, who I mentioned earlier, El Monte man, they bought some large pieces of property on the north end of Rancho San Pedro, owned by the Dominguez family. And they probably got it for pennies on the dollar. And they were able to buy several tracts of that rancho. And they subdivided it. So they initially called the town they were going to build there Gibsonville. It was called Centerville for a while. And then George Compton came in and bought a lot of it at the end of the 1860s. So it became known as Compton. And so this is an early example of a subdivision that Temple was involved in as things were starting to improve at the end of the 1860s. This map, which is in the Huntington Library, shows what they had been subdividing during that period, and some of the news articles from 1867 thereabouts. And so that this growth period is just starting to happen. And this is one of the early examples of where you see people taking advantage of the opportunity to subdivide ranch property into smaller tracts for farming and towns and that sort of thing. That's just going to continue to accelerate into the 1870s. He was involved in many things. I won't go into a lot of detail about any of this stuff, but FPF was involved in the Los Angeles Water Works, which was a project where they built a water wheel north of downtown Los Angeles along the river, had a pipe brought down into town. There was a brick reservoir that was put into the plaza. I'll have photos from the 1870s in that next presentation of that. And the idea was to get a more reliable source of water for the community. There was a flood later that damaged the water wheel, destroyed it actually, and wound up bankrupting the business. But it was an attempt to try to get a little more professionalization and expansion of what was being done. Having a woolen mill, sheep were being imported. So even though the cattle industry had really started to decline by the end of the 1860s, there was a big expansion in sheep raising. The Bixby's, for example, had done that in Northern California, and so they brought that to the Rancho Los Cerritos. And there were many others, including French migrants, who were doing that because that had been done in Europe. So there was a woolen mill that was built in Los Angeles. Temple was a partner with others in that. Having, again, a way to take property, subdivide it, build upon it, or sell to builders and developers. So there was the LA Homestead and Building Association. This was a new thing in the community. Temple was president initially of that. A future mayor, James Toberman, was secretary, and one of the early architects was involved in this. So it's a way, again, to develop the real estate industry in a more professional manner. Even transportation, there were just different things going on in the late 1860s. The first local railroad was built from Los Angeles to San Pedro. The Workmans and Temples weren't involved in that, but FPF did have a cutoff road that he built from Los Angeles to San Bernardino with a guy named William W. Rubottom, great name. Rubottom had lived in El Monte and out in Rancho Cucamonga, and then he created a community called Spadra, which is now Southwest Pomona, and the two of them worked to try to get a shorter way to get out to San Bernardino. So just a variety of projects that are indications of how things are starting to change and the business community of LA is starting to grow. Now, part of the facilitation of this is going to be the establishment of banks. Banks were technically illegal in California for almost 20 years. The Constitution of 1849 did not allow for banks because there was so much controversy with those on the East Coast. There was very little government regulation. So banks had free reign, and a lot of our economic panics broke out because of banking practices that were not at all safe or sound. But it started to change by the end of the 1860s, and you started to see actual banks being created. So in 1868, we had two that opened in Los Angeles, one called Hayward and Company. Hayward is a town up north, and there was a guy up there who was a pretty powerful person. His son was sent down here to open a bank with John Downey, former governor of California. That was in the spring. And then in the fall, the Workmans and Temples partnered with Isaiah W. Hellman, a very young but very effective and good merchant. Hellman had a store that he'd been operating for several years and had a banking practice he sort of did informally with this store. And so the three partners decided that they were going to open their new business in a two-story brick building built by former Governor Pio Pico. So a lot of us know about the Pico House Hotel a little bit north of this. This is the east side of Main Street. The 101 goes right through this big building today. But Pico had another structure that he built during this time period as he was trying to get his footing in the LA business community. So Hellman, Temple and Company opened in the fall of 1868 in this structure. And there's an early advertisement for the bank as it was getting ready to open. And Hellman knew what he was doing. He was incredibly skilled at business and finance. And if things had gone correctly, Workman and Temple would have let him do his thing. He later went on to run Wells Fargo, the Bank of Nevada, lots of other enterprises. And if they had just let him handle everything, they would have been very, very successful. And there may not be a homestead museum or jobs for Alex and myself, because who knows if the Workmans and Temples might still be there at the homestead today if things had gone differently. But this looked good on paper, and it seemed like it was going to be a very successful enterprise. And it seemed like that as you go into the 1870s. When the bank opened, by the way, they had lots of people show up. They quaffed generous amounts of wine for the prosperity of the new bank, which, by the way, was said was the first building erected here with any regard to elegance. So that made Pico look pretty good. And of course, there'll be more buildings coming later in the 60s and into the 70s to really transform the look of Los Angeles. Politically, the families were pretty active. William Workman, not so much. He only ran for office once in 1859 for county supervisor, did not win that election. He ran as a Democrat. A lot of the Democrats who were pro-slavery, it's not clear if Workman was in that group because he did not run as a mainstream Democrat. Whereas FPF Temple, who was from Massachusetts, was a Whig, would be a Republican once that party formed, but you didn't want to say you were a Republican. That was, the Democrats were so dominant. So by the time you get to the Civil War era, sometimes you have these interesting mixes. Bell was one of the several candidates for president that year. That's partly why Abraham Lincoln won, is because there were so many candidates at one time. It was a split thing, ticket. So Temple was part of a group that was, again, mostly Northerners, anti-slavery people who were supporting that. But they wouldn't say Republican. It would be the Union state ticket during the Civil War. That would be the way you would express it, especially in Los Angeles as you were trying to win elections. But the Democrats really ruled the roost out here during those periods. Now I want to pivot over to another branch of the Workman family, which I mentioned last time. In the mid-1850s, William Workman's brother, David, migrated from Missouri to Los Angeles, bringing with him his wife and his 3 sons, as well as William Workman's own son, Joseph, who had been sent back east to go to school and had lived away from the family for a number of years. David, the patriarch of that family, was killed in an accident driving stock up to the gold mines for his brother. And so the widow and 3 sons left La Puente Rancho and moved into Los Angeles. And one of the sons, the eldest, Thomas, went to work at the harbor at San Pedro and Wilmington for Phineas Banning, who was the dominant figure down there. And so Thomas Workman was the clerk for Banning and seemed very promising. He was a candidate for the county clerk in 1861, did not win that election, but a lot of people felt like he was an up and coming figure. He, interestingly, of his brothers, he was the one who was more on the Republican side of things. So he ran on the Union County ticket. I don't think he could have worked for Phineas Banning, who was a dedicated Republican, unless he held to that point of view, whereas his brothers were actually more aligned with the Democrats during those years. Thomas, unfortunately, was on a steamship. And what they did back then at the harbors, they had a small craft that would take you out to a bigger ship anchored offshore, because we didn't have much of a harbor, and they were trying to work on that. And so Phineas Banning and his clerk, Thomas Workman, and a lot of other people were on this little boat, and a squall came up, a big wave, and it pushed the boat and rocked it, and part of it went underwater and then bounced back up. And when it did that, the cold water hit the boiler and it exploded. This is not an uncommon thing in those years. And it was devastating. The explosion killed many people, including Thomas Workman. So this is the obituary on the bottom of that. The Hancock Disaster was pretty well known in Los Angeles. This is the early 1860s. There were 2 other sons, though, Elijah, the middle, and William Henry, the younger. And the 2 of them eventually went into business in the family trade, which was saddlery and harness. This is what their father, and I would think William Workman probably also, had learned in England, because their father practiced this business in Missouri for many years. And then they brought this to Los Angeles. There had only been one saddler in Los Angeles. This is how small the town was, a guy named Samuel C. Foy. The Foy name some of you may have heard of, because Samuel's daughter, Mary, wound up becoming the first female librarian in Los Angeles. But the Workman brothers established a saddlery business that on and off they ran for quite a number of years. These are advertisements during the 1860s for their business. They started out in what was called the Temple Lock, and then they moved to another building nearby by the end of the decade. But they were quite successful in this business over the course of many years. This is the Lanfranco block on the east side of Main Street, basically between Temple and First, and that is where they had their business. They were known for their rooftop sign with the horse and the street number and the identification of their business. Now, these young men were also becoming quite involved politically. Elijah was on the city council during the late 1860s. His brother wound up becoming a city council member and a mayor and city treasurer much later on. But they were both pretty involved in things politically. Again, the Democratic Party was their thing primarily during these years. And then William Henry Workman, the youngest of the three brothers, is going to marry a young woman, Maria Boyle, whose father, Andrew, shown here in the middle, was owner of a property called Paradon Blanco on the east side of the LA River. And that would become Boyle Heights. And so there's a connection going on there. So when we get to later parts of this series and we start talking more about the LA Workmans and them becoming more prominent out there, we'll pick up that story with that as well. So really what we're looking at is a transition at the end of the 1860s. And that's when you start seeing some of the earliest photographs. Purportedly, the earliest known photo of LA is in 1861. If that's true, there weren't any more for about 8 more years. In any case, by 1870, you start seeing a really small but growing documentation photographically of what the area looked like. So these are just 3 examples that I think illustrate the change going on. The larger one here on the right, obviously, I think taken from the plaza looking south to show where things were going and how things were changing. So you've got the old Plaza Church on the right, emblematic of the Mexican era of Los Angeles. The Pico House Hotel was Governor or ex-Governor Pico's attempt to keep the plaza viable by developing a new high-class building, a fine hotel. It really didn't succeed in that because the movement, mostly by Americans and Europeans, was to expand Los Angeles to the south along Main Street, including the Temple block, which is located down here at the bottom on the right side. And again, I think this photo was taken to give you an idea of where things were moving. This one is on the opposite part of town. This is basically Main Street and between 10th and 11th, which is a pretty gritty industrial area today, but it's the suburbs. You can see the gap between the home of Elijah Workman, this is his property, and where the city was at that point. This is again about 1870. So if you know this area at all, Main Street here on the right, it splinters off and Spring Street would make its pathway right about where 9th comes in today. So Spring, Main, and 9th would be right where this pointer is. But you can see how far removed the town was, even just from basically not too far north of Interstate 10 as it runs through that part of LA. The bottom photo is taken from one of the hills looking into downtown. This is the Temple block area I talked about in the previous presentation. This was the market house that Jonathan Temple had built at the end of the 1850s. By the early 60s, it was not viable as a commercial building where you would have small market stalls. It became the county courthouse as well as some offices, and was known as the courthouse for many, many years. But in the foreground, you can see construction. There had been an adobe building on this spot that appears in some earlier photographs, but it's been replaced by a brick structure. And so that's a lot of what's happening as you move into the 1870s. Is the change is really underway with the types of buildings, the building materials, what the uses are for as well. So what we're going to do next time around, and we have the date of September 19th on the docket for this, is we'll pick up the story of the Workman and Temple families in 1870s Los Angeles. So I hope you'll join us then for that. And with that, I'll turn things back over to Alex, and thank you all very much for listening.
All right. Thank you, Paul. So great to see those primary sources up close, and to be able to really look at the detail in some of those images. We've got a question that just came in. Where did the bricks come from that we're seeing in that new construction?
That's a great question. The first brick manufacturer was in the very early 1850s, a guy named Jesse Hunter. And they would basically just set up their brick making operation somewhere where they just got the right kind of soil mix to be able to make their bricks. He was followed by a couple of other brick makers. Joseph Mullally was another one. Mullally wound up being the main brick maker for quite a number of years. And then if they had to go out to the suburbs, so for example, John Rowland's house, Rowland tore down his old adobe home and built a new brick home in 1855, just 3 years after the first bricks were made. And Mullally did that, but what he did is he brought a crew out to Rancho La Puente and they made the bricks on site. So that's what you would typically see. Even into the 1870s, there's a Phillips mansion in Pomona that is made by Mullally also 20 years later. And same thing, they would go out to the site and manufacture the bricks there. So there would be brickmakers in LA having their bricks made and ready to go for that area. But if you wanted something out in the hinterlands, they would go out and make the bricks on site in those early years.
Great. Another question we have here from Janet, didn't William Workman move some cattle north of the mountains during the drought?
Yes, he did a couple of things. So in 1864, when the drought was really bad, one of his friends, William Wolfskill, who had acquired not that long before some ranch land in Orange County, he had mining interests in the Mojave. So he was actually up in that area to do his mining investigations. But he noticed it was grass growing in, of all places, that lower desert area just at the base of the San Bernardino Mountains on the north side. So basically north of Big Bear. And Wolfskill saw grass there. So when he got back home, he told his foreman, a guy named Joseph Pleasance, hey, take our cattle up there and pasture them there. And then he invited Workman and Rowland and Temple to join him. So they sent their animals out that direction. They were there almost a year and a half until the drought ended. So that saved a lot of animals and prevented a big financial problem for the Workmans and Temples because of Wolfskill's generosity. I will also say later on that when Workman had his cattle, and this is the end of the 1860s, there was another drought that took place. He actually sent an agent down to Baja California and had that guy look into having some of the animals sent all the way down there. You can imagine how long it would take to drive cattle that far. We're talking 150 miles probably, something like that. But he did the same in the Inyo County, Owens Valley area. That same agent was sent up there in 1870 to pasture animals. So yeah, they had to find places to take these animals during those drought years. And if they had the means financially to do that, like a William Workman could do that, then that's one thing. A lot of ranchers didn't have that kind of ability to, on that scale, to do that.
Yeah. Denise made a comment saying, it was really interesting that even the U.S. president, the scale that it had to go up to have the land grant approved, that was a real surprise that it went that far up.
Yeah, it's a federal process. It's having to get the government to do that. So I don't think Andrew Johnson probably analyzed these in any serious way. I think he just obviously would rely on the Department of the Interior and the Secretary of the Interior to make the final determination. I'm not even sure if the Interior Secretary spent much time at it either, because it was big bureaucracy even back then. So they just had to go through that process. But the problem for the landowners is you have to wait a long, long time to get those patents. So Workman and Rowland were somewhat lucky. 15 years wasn't as bad as a lot of other folks had to wait.
BJ had a general question of who is doing the labor. And this question came up when we were talking about new construction in Los Angeles, but maybe also in terms of making the bricks like you were talking about that are going out to different work sites.
Yeah, there's a big change in labor that is happening during this period for sure. The smallpox epidemics that took place in the 1860s were huge. And in fact, Alex and I were just sharing information today about vaccinations finally coming to the area by the end of the 1860s. Brand new vaccine, the first real vaccine was for smallpox and was being advertised in the late 1860s. But in the earlier part of the decade, large numbers of Latinos and natives were killed by smallpox. And so that had been the workforce for a lot of that, ranch work, other kinds of labor. And so it created a real issue in terms of how you're going to find workers. So some of that was solved by migrants coming in from other parts of the United States. Part of it also, though, was Chinese laborers who were brought down at the end of the 1860s, initially mainly to work on the first railroads being built in the area. But some of them wound up doing other kinds of labor as well. So I think it's a combination of those things. But yeah, that's a big issue because it's right around that let's say 1865 is kind of the cutoff for that. Before that, most of the labor is going to be native and Spanish speaking. And then after that, you're going to see more labor.
All right. Another question here from Alan. Did Workman's brand of wine ever take off? He invested in a wine press, 3 buildings. What came of it?
Yeah, I wish we had better documentation of that. There is some indication that because of his son-in-law being from Massachusetts, they were able to send some of that product back to the East Coast. There were other vineyardists who were doing that. Matthew Keller is probably the most prominent, along with Benjamin D. Wilson. They had connections, or they started companies where they were sending stuff back to New York, Boston, Philadelphia, those areas. San Francisco was more local market too. So I guess the thing is that as LA County was the prime winemaking center of California for a little while into this period, San Francisco is your immediate market, but there was starting to be an expansion outward of that. How much of Workman's product was marketed under his name is a question we have not been able to answer. There's just not the documentation for that. I met a guy some years ago who told me he had a bottle that had a label that had Workman's name on it. And then I lost contact with him. I don't think he's living any longer, and I don't know what happened to his collection. So I wonder about that, if there was some of that happening. But we do know that Workman was shipping out fairly large barrels of wine, numbers of barrels, by the end of the 60s and into the 70s. The question is, how was it marketed and sold? And was it under his name? And that we just haven't been able to find documentation for yet.
Got it. All right, folks, if there are any other pressing questions or new questions that have come up, you've got a minute or two here to type them in the chat or put them in a comment box here on Facebook for Paul to answer for us. You've asked some great questions that lead to a whole other variety of topics.
Yeah, was pressing a play on words there, Alex?
No, that was lucky.
And while we're waiting, I'll just, if you, those of you who are still with us, if you have not had enough history, I am doing one at 5 o'clock on Andrew Boyle and some of that early history of Boyle Heights through the Boyle Heights Community Partners group. So if you look up Boyle Heights Community Partners online, you can probably find that.
Can you put a link to that in the chat, Paul?
Yes, I probably can do that, or at least put the name down.
Yeah, that would be great. And then I can transfer that over to Facebook too.
Get to chat, so.
Okay, BJ says fascinating, thank you. Kevin says great presentation, thank you. Thanks to all of you for joining us and asking these great questions. Let's see if we've got anything else coming in here. All right. Okay, so there, Paul's got that in the chat for us. Boyle Heights Community Partners, Andrew Boyle Talk at 5 p.m. So drop that into Google search and you should be able to get to that information. All right, looks like we're good to go. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us. Thank you so much, Paul, for putting this presentation together for us. We're looking forward to the 1870s and to later this month when we'll have another program on the 25th. So keep taking a look at our website, at our social media. If you missed any of today's program, be sure to check our YouTube channel for a full recording that you can also share with anybody else you think might be interested. So thanks again for joining us today, folks. We hope you enjoyed the rest of your afternoon. Bye-bye.